Welcome all of you to our fourth episode of the webinar series organized by the Institute for Minority Rights at Eurac Research on minorities and COVID-19. I'm Roberta Medda-Windischer, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Minority Rights here at Eurac Research, and I have the pleasure to moderate the discussion of today's webinar. Our focus today is to discuss the specific consequences, limitations, and discriminatory practices that religious minorities are experiencing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. By now, it's largely acknowledged that the COVID pandemic has amplified and will probably amplify also inequalities and vulnerabilities. But which specific problems, obstacles, and restrictions religious minorities face in their religious practices, celebrations, rituals, and more generally in the enjoyment of their rights and freedoms in comparison to majority mainstream religious groups? We will discuss these issues with three distinguished panelists that I will introduce them to you now. The first is Detlev Rein. Detlev is an independent researcher in the field of minority protection who for the last 4 years has been member of the advisory committee of the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities of the Council of Europe. Previously, Detlev was the head of the Division for Regional Minorities and Regional Languages at the German Ministry of Interior. Then we have Kyriaki Topidi, Senior Research Associate at the European Center for Minority Issues, ECMI. Her research focuses on religion, education, and online hate speech. And her next monograph, forthcoming with Routledge, is on religious rights in public education. Then we have Kerstin Wonisch, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Minority Rights here at Eurac Research and Graz University. Her research focuses on religious minorities in international and in traditional Islamic law, Islamic feminism, and Islamic pluralism in liberal democracies. Our discussion will last approximately 1 hour, and I encourage all participants from the audience to comment and send their questions through the chat. My colleague Johanna Mitterhofer is the chat moderator of our session today. So my first question to our panelists is about groups and rights affected. So which religious minorities, religious groups have been, in your opinion, and will be particularly affected by the COVID-19 emergency? Which aspects connected to freedom of religion and belief of minority groups have been and are particularly targeted? I would start first with you, Detlev. As in this almost all-female panel, you are in a sort of minority. Then Kyriaki and then Kerstin. I would ask all of you to be very concise as much as possible so that we can pick up more questions from the chat. Please, Detlev, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberta, and good afternoon to all. To my understanding, there are not many religious minorities in Europe. International and national minority law protects the ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and religious identity of persons belonging to national minorities. Some minorities have their own specific religion, but most of them belong to the religion or religions of the mainstream population. Nevertheless, international law protects the freedom of religion of all minorities, also when they are not predominantly characterized by their religion. The believers of all Abrahamic religions have, as to speak, an inner and an outer religious sphere, forum internum and forum externum. The inner sphere, that is the belief itself and the prayers in solitude, are not touched by the measures against the coronavirus. But the outer sphere of all the book religions, which involves the communal practice of religious services in special places, is intensively touched and changed by restricted ambition to services and hygienic rules in times of COVID-19. I just can list. The regular divine service is perhaps the most important gathering of believers, but we must also see the individual events and ceremonies accompanying members of religious communities from birth to death, baptism or circumcision, First Holy Communion, confirmation, bar and bat mitzvah, weddings and funerals. Most of these events are, under normal conditions, the occasion or even obligation for the gathering of many family members and friends. We must also take into account Quran schools, confirmation classes, and marriage preparation, and last but not least, processions and pilgrimages. Thank you.
Thank you, Detlev. Kyriaki, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to Eurac for the invitation to be part of this panel. From my own personal perspective, all the previous webinars have been particularly instructive, and I hope that this one will be as much. Now, coming to the question, I think your question actually has two parts. One is who is affected, and then the second part obviously is which aspects of the freedom of religion and belief are mostly touched by the pandemic. So as to the first part, allow me to give you 2 or 3 introductory remarks, which will of course then lead to examples that we already know of religious minorities that have been affected. My first point, and I think we need to understand this at the outset before we discuss any of the aspects, is that the pandemic has created a very fertile ground for prejudice against minority groups in general, not just religious minorities. However, as we all know, those of us that are engaged in minority studies, this kind of prejudice does not operate in a vacuum, but it's probably a continuation or an amplification of simmering prejudice. To be more concrete, think of the connection between the December 2019 citizenship law in India, which was a path for undocumented religious minorities, and how that was later on evidenced and translated in discrimination against specific religious minorities, in particular the Muslim groups and the Tablighi Jamaat group, more specifically, that was blamed for disseminating the virus. Second point that I want to make at the outset is that there's a historical correlation between infectious disease rates and prejudice. There are studies that actually make that connection, and there are actually even historical examples that show how the two are tightly connected. And here, I think for us Europeans, very characteristic one would be the persecution of Jews during the Black Plague in the 14th century. So this is not a new thing, the connection between disease, infection, and prejudice. And my third and last point before I begin with the examples is a very commonsensical one. Fear amplifies prejudice. And on the basis of that, the pandemic and the fear of surrounding the threat that the pandemic poses is obviously very fertile ground for the spreading of prejudice. In terms of examples, I think there is a great variety across the globe. I will just mention a few for our listeners and viewers to understand how common, unfortunately and regrettably common, the phenomenon has been. One obvious example is South Korea, and a particular group of Christians, the so-called Sinjeonji Church of Jesus, which group was ostracized precisely because they were perceived to be spreading the virus. Then there is the famous, quote, infamous example of China. Tibetans and Uyghur Muslims are particularly affected. India, which I already mentioned. For India, particularly disturbing is the example of records being made of separate wards in certain Gujarati hospitals between Hindus and Muslims. So we know that this matters in practice and on the ground. Malaysia is another example, online and offline xenophobia and hate speech against the Rohingya. Pakistan, multiple groups are affected. Christians, especially those included in sanitation work and exposed to contaminated waste without any personal protective equipment. Saudi Arabia, there's an interesting group of Middle Eastern states that actually have been discriminating within the same faith. So between Shias and Sunnis. Saudi Arabia in particular sealed off an entire province home to 500,000 of Shia Muslims, and it was the only province in the country that was sealed off. Why? Because the government is Sunni dominated while the province was obviously Shia dominated. Similar practices have been recorded to be used by Bahrain. So there is a group of states that practice or have practiced that kind of policies affecting directly religious minorities. And then we have examples from Sri Lanka and anti-Muslim sentiments, particularly when it comes to collective expressions of religious freedom of Muslims, burials, more specifically, and then bringing us back to Europe. And I think one of your speakers in the previous webinars mentioned that the triangle Norway, Finland, Sweden, and how they have been willfully or unwillfully, I would say, affecting Somali groups. These groups have been recorded to be experiencing 7 to 10 times, if I'm not mistaken, more the virus compared to the real proportion, the real population proportion. So there is some kind of, if you want, disbalanced impact in terms of the pandemic. Now, coming to the aspect, as was very correctly pointed out by the previous speaker, I think it's the collective exercise that is affected most. There are discussions happening in several states as to the public banning of public gatherings, religious gatherings, including services, and to what extent that is compatible or incompatible with what the World Health Organization has been issuing in terms of guidelines. Is it genuine, or is it there to clamp dissent and religious freedoms? Three specific aspects that are very empirically demonstrated in terms of the aspects of the right mostly affected is congregation, that was mentioned. Religious rights and pastoral care, that was also mentioned. It's harder to adapt rituals under confinement conditions. And then the third aspect, which I think we tend to neglect, but which is super important, especially for the vulnerable groups, is charitable work, childcare, relief, and so on, because that puts beneficiaries in, if you want, increased danger and exposure to the disease and the pandemic. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this overview, Kyriaki. Kerstin, please.
Hello and welcome also from my side. Thanks, first of all, to the whole Institute for Minority Rights, to the whole team, because this is really something unique and special which has been set up. And it's a collective effort, and then this brings me also to the collective side of freedom of religion, right? Because as the previous speakers already pointed out very well, it's the collective dimension of freedom of religion, which is mostly in danger or in violation now during this pandemic. And I want to link it a little bit also to the group of states that Kyriaki just mentioned, because what we see now, especially when we look at states in the Middle Eastern context, for example, I guess we need to understand the different historical developments also in terms of how minorities are framed, how minorities are conceptualized, and how minorities in different parts of the world are enshrined in legal protection, because it's not out of the blue that some of the states mentioned by Kyriaki, for example, especially in the Middle Eastern context, have a very specific and sometimes narrow approach to minority rights, because it's coming from legal concepts maybe enshrined in Islamic law, developed then throughout the history. So this has an impact on what we see on the ground, especially now, as Kyriaki well mentioned, the example of Saudi Arabia, and this sealing off of this province with Shia communities, because what we see is also a rivalry between Sunni and Shia Islam, of course, impacting on communities on the ground. And this has strong impacts also on which communities get recognition, which communities are recognized in legal systems. This all relates to these things, and we need to understand how dynamic, and how the religious landscape in that region is constantly changing kind of power relations. So power relations are an aspect in this group of states there, and we need not forget to look on this historical context. Now, using the metaphor having been framed in the last episode by my colleague Sergio, this X-ray, I'm zooming out from the Middle East now and coming a bit more to the European perspective. Because what we see here, Detlev said well that we have no religious minorities, kind of. I mean, quite provocatively put, let's say it like that. I would rather disagree. I guess there are minority communities having religious imprints here in Europe as well, which need special protection. But what is visible now during this pandemic is that we see a rise of anti-Semitic crimes, anti-Semitism. It's definitely on the rise, and it connects back to history as well. And on the other side, what we see is a rise on Islamophobia. So this goes also hand in hand with hate speeches and with crimes related to this kind of phobia. So, and this, I guess, is also kind of how minority rights in Europe kind of evolved and yeah, kind of were framed, because during the Middle Ages and coming up to the modern period, the first minorities kind of were always religious ones, more or less. I mean, we can argue on how it developed, but how the whole system of othering and groups trying to accommodate, we were a Catholic, more or less Catholic Christian dominated country or even continent. And then with the Jews, we already had problems. So I guess, again, using the X-ray and coming very back to the universal level, what is crucial when we think of religious minorities, more or less, is also the way this concept evolved in different contexts, in different social, economic spheres. And I guess we need to take that into account when we speak now about the protection and the vulnerability of those groups. So I leave it for now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kerstin. My second question for the three panelists, it's about the derogations to freedom of religion. We know that there is the risk that, as in many other emergency time, some authoritarian or even not necessarily authoritarian regime misuse this time of emergency to legitimize anti-democratic practices or to limit freedom of religion for certain specific groups. So do you see in your analysis, in your sort of observatory, cases of derogations to freedom of religion and belief beyond the necessities of the COVID-19 emergency? And I now will change the rotation of the question, so I will ask Kyriaki to continue, then Kerstin and Detlev, please.
That's actually a very burning and interesting question, in the sense that, of course, here what we are called to discuss is how far can a government go in limiting religious freedom in the name of fighting what is labeled as a health pandemic. And in empirical terms, I don't think, as far as I know at least, we don't have a full range of knowledge of the discriminatory impact of state responses. So it is a bit early to give a very, if you want, sophisticated answer to that. However, what is already becoming evident is that there are certain patterns. Now, before I move on into discussing a few of those patterns, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves the following. International law does recognize emergency. However, when it does recognize those stances of emergencies, it calls on states to continue to ensure non-discrimination at the same level. So there is no derogation. The obligation stands. And the obligation stands both on the purpose of the measures that they have to take, as well as the effects of those measures. So with that framework in mind, I think it is clear that, as we already mentioned, the states have the tendency to limit for example, in scenarios of religious gatherings, the rights of minorities in a sense which is perhaps or can be construed as a violation of the freedom of religious freedom and belief. There are, of course, lines that need to be drawn, and we're not at ease at this stage to draw those lines. Why? Because on the one hand, we have guidelines, World Health Organization guidelines on public gatherings, and then there is, of course, on the other hand, state discretion. Illustration of how that can go wrong was, I mean, I think I already mentioned the Chinese example. There is also evidence that this is happening, as we already said, also in India, so I would not like to repeat myself. And then let us look at some more advanced ways of doing so in the online environment. And for example, consider practices targeted against Ahmadis in Pakistan through Twitter, and how that kind of creates a very hostile environment in the way that freedom of expression is managed and protected in connection to religious identity. Or an alternative scenario, which is not, unfortunately, too uncommon, is the refusal to provide food and aid in developing countries to particular religious groups. I'm thinking again of Muslim majority countries refusing such food aid to Christians or Hindus. So essentially. Refusal of access to medical care for Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. So these are the kinds of patterns which obviously illustrate extreme scenarios of state intervention against the respect of the right to religious freedom with concrete impact. And of course, and I will stop with that, it illustrates the value of and the need, actually the pressing need for a more cooperative approach between governments and religious groups in terms of partnership as opposed to competition for resources. Thank you.
Kerstin, please.
I think I will pick up where Kyriaki actually left, because she left with the need for a stronger partnership between a religion and state, for example, or religious communities and the state. And I guess that's also kind of an underlying problem when it comes to the recognition of minority groups and which regimes are set up in terms of how can actually religious communities access their minority rights. It needs a state to recognize a minority, or at least to conclude a contract. And there actually, it's also a problem that so many states, which Kyriaki outlined perfectly well, from India to the Muslim community, the Muslim world, but also coming back, in terms of prohibiting or denying access to the rights, denying recognition, denying state contracts with religious communities, for example. But on the other hand, we know that especially when it comes to, for example, religious minority communities in Africa, they can be strong partners when you talk to religious leaders, get them on board, communicate the need for special measures having been taken in order to, spread the virus, like closure of mosques, for example. If you have strong partners in the religious communities, it's way easier for a state then to communicate measures. I'm not saying that there are no violations at all, and Kyriaki outlined these violations quite well. But I'm just underlying and trying to shed a bit light also on the need for legal recognition, for how to kind of frame relationships between state and religious communities. And maybe we can talk about it in the next questions, upcoming minutes as well, because I guess this is also kind of a root problem in terms of minority protection, religious minority communities, and how and why states at the moment are so good in kind of impacting on the especially collective aspect of freedom of religion. I'll leave it here.
Detlev, perhaps you want to also to respond to Kerstin's comment on your initial statement about the existence of religious minorities in Europe.
Yes, I did count that, and even the Jewish community, which is in all states of Europe, is acknowledged as a minority only in 19 states. And in some states, they didn't want explicitly not to be recognized. But of course, Judaism has a special problem at the moment. In my country, at least, I see a big difference in the way some right-wing extremists and conspiracy theorists react to the spreading of the virus. Christian religions are not in the focus of these groups. Regrettably, it is Judaism in particular which is accused of trying to achieve world domination by way of world Jewish conspiracy, a crude figment of imagination and deliberate disinformation, and they put this world Jewish conspiracy together with Bill Gates, the deep state, and China. This dangerous nonsense appears as well in the so-called social media as in the course of demonstrations. To me, it is a duty of all governmental and non-governmental organizations and of well-known personalities to fight these monstrosities. On the question of the always complicated relation between state and religious communities, I would like to report a positive example of the action of state in respect of COVID-19. It stems from the federal state, North Rhine-Westphalia, where I live. In March, the state government issued a Corona decree by which many public activities were prohibited, as in many other countries, especially events and assemblies. In respect of religious assemblies, it reads, assemblies for the exercise of religion do not take place. Churches, Muslim communities, and Jewish communities have made appropriate declarations. And in April, the state prime minister invited the representatives of the Abrahamic religions once again to discuss the initial process of easing the prohibitions and invited them to set the hygienic rules for the celebration of divine services with limited numbers of attendance of worshippers. To me, this is a good practice in the complicated field of the relations between the state and the religious communities.
My third question is about an aspect that was already mentioned by Kyriaki, if I'm not mistaken, and is about the sort of collective versus individual dimension of religion, let's say in the near future, rather than obviously during the lockdown. Many people and many analysts have actually identified the sort of cabin fever syndrome. So the tendency to remain at home, refusing to meet other people, although it is now permitted in most countries. So do you see this tendency towards a more individualistic dimension of religion that may affect collective rituals and ceremonies or participation of places of worship in the near future? So so that more people, or on the contrary, you see as a consequence a tendency to look for a more collective dimension of religious practices. And I will start now with Kerstin and then Detlev and Kyriaki, please.
Well, I guess we might see a combination of both, because what we see now, at least here in Austria, for example, once the mosques have been reopened, once the church now has permitted already and started again to offer services, people are rather flocking. So there we have lots of people attending those collective celebrations and the places of worship again. This is also true for the Islamic community here, who actually then held the whole service and the whole mass and the whole prayers outside because of a lack of space. So I guess that's, in that sense, collective expression of freedom of religion in terms of going to the mosque, going to the temple, going to the synagogue, to wherever, is not decreasing. Rather the contrary, at least what I can witness here in Austria. But on the other hand, I guess lots of these online services, online lectures, online prayers, I guess to some extent, this will remain because religious communities have been quite active in setting up online services, online lectures, online discussion rounds, and thereby actually reaching much more people than they would have if they would have just offered a normal kind of evening with a seminar with a prominent figure giving the talk. So I guess this is also an opportunity for communities to spread out their beliefs, their rituals, and to attract maybe the interest of the lay public audience, let's say it like this. So I guess we will see a mixture. And that's why I think looking at the collective side of freedom of religion and looking how to better protect the collective aspect, I guess this is something which will which will make us busy also in the upcoming months and years, because I guess there is a much stronger need to come up with tools on how to protect and promote actually also this collective aspect of freedom of religion. Thank you.
Detlev, the floor is yours.
I see a difference between the big religious communities and the small ones. To the members of the big religious communities, that is in Germany, especially the Roman Catholics and the Protestant Church, it is quite clear that they follow what their churches have arranged for, that is only a certain percentage of the church chairs can be used and so on, and you have hygienic rules and so on. What was in the beginning astonishing, that with two free churches in Germany, small denominations, there are infections happening after religious ceremonies. In one case, with a small community, there were 2 weeks later more than 100 infected persons. And as they do not have to follow, let's say, the orders of the bishop or the archbishop, they did sing without masks in the ceremony, and they had afterwards dinner together and so on. So they are endangered because they esteem to be something other than the big religions and might follow other rules. So they endanger themselves when they do not follow the general hygienic rules. With the main population, they are now, I would say, nearly used to the new rules and to list in before they go to the religious service or so on. So the small communities are not only endangered by the surrounding, but by themselves, because they're sticking closer together. Thank you.
Kyriaki, on the collective individual dimension. I see.
I think what I can say at this point, I'm sorry, I'm having some troubles with the connection here, unfortunately. But what I can say to add to this discussion in terms of impact between the collective and the individual dimension is that, to me, the line is not so clear. I think that there is a significant element of overlap. So the collective influences the individual and vice versa. And I also don't see so much of distinction, if you wish, in terms of the impact that the pandemic has had on the specific point between minorities and majorities. There is one common point which I think we should reflect on and we should think about, is that because of the situation that we have been experiencing, religions have had to evolve their roles and practices in response to the conditions of the day. This is not, again, unprecedented. It has happened in the past, whether it was due to politics, war, disease, or even theological evolutions. So your imam calls you to have prayers at home during Ramadan, this is a new way of praying, I guess. Or when you're celebrating Eucharist, otherwise not through the sharing of a spoon, that's also a need to adapt to these circumstances. Or not kissing your mezuzah outside of your Jewish home, or observing online virtual baptisms, weddings, so on and so forth. All of these, I think, are illustrations of the fact that we are trying to strike a balance between reconciling observance of faith with public safety. And because this is a new situation, I think it's something that causes a lot of concern and a lot of tension at times also to many members, but also religious groups per se. What I think, though, is crucial in this context is the understanding that whatever kind of evolution needs to happen should come internally from the group, the inner group itself, and not imposed externally, because that would create other sorts of tensions and pressures, legal, social, political eventually. And then the second point that we should also take into account is that people tend to value freedom of religious expression as much as the right to health, and they should not be put in a position to have to choose between these two essential rights. And this is where, if you want the broader discussion of how do we create forms of accountable governance in conditions like those that we have experienced, comes into place, and how it becomes crucial. Thank you.
Thank you. We have two questions from the chat that I can somehow combine, and is a question about to what extent democracies can actually. One is a question from Mirza from India. Democracies and in general nation states can be useful somehow to respond to the discrimination against minorities. And this is linked to another question from Faisal from the Paris Peace Forum on sovereign nation organizations. So to wrap up somehow the two questions, to combine the two questions, what could sovereign nation organizations at a regional or international level, such as the Council of Europe, UN, or OSCE, what could they do to address this rise of discrimination, prejudice against religious minorities? And also, let's include also what role civil society, NGOs, activists could do against scapegoating, hate speech through social media. I will start with Detlev this time, and then Kyriaki and Kerstin. Please, Detlev.
To respond to the last question first, awareness campaigns are the order of the day, based on current research and on the current trend and the authors. And in this undertaking, all levels of public and private life should be involved, from the United Nations to the mayor of a small municipality, from the leaders of all majority and minority religions, denominations, to the local church officials. And to the question, what can international European law at least can do, I would like to cite Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which sets, I would say, quite practical items to our question. It reads, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. Freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs shall be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interests of public safety, for the protection of public order, health, or morals, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. So, if you are willing, this is a quite useful norm. And the European Court of Human Rights has up to today 160 decisions with respect to this Article 9. And about 90 of these refer to minority matters or aspects. And then there is a Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. It contains 5 articles which protect freedom of religion, religious identity, manifestation and practice of religion, and foster the spreading of knowledge on religion. In the course of its monitoring, the Advisory Committee has published about 160 opinions, most of them containing questions about the religious rights of minorities. So, in the European context, we can draw on 2 rich sources to find the guidelines to our questions. And the Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention pays a special attention to the rights of minorities in times of pandemics and has passed a statement last week, noting with deep concern that the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the vulnerability of certain national minorities in many countries and has deepened the already existing inequalities in many Council of Europe member states. The Advisory Committee will continue to follow closely the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the respect of rights of persons belonging to national minorities and to ensure that states' responses are in compliance with their human rights obligations.
Thanks. Kyriaki.
I think I would like to widen a bit the question, which I think is timely, and perhaps act in completion, if you want, complementarily to what Detlev has just said. I think that if we want to answer those 2 questions, we need to adopt a multilateral approach. And when I say multilateral, I think we need to acknowledge that there are more than one players in action when we're want to respond to a pandemic type, and also the concerns of religious minorities. So in this constellation of actors, obviously you have a consideration for states. States, if we want to answer directly the question, can democracies be useful? Yes, they can, to the extent that they decide that they conduct, for example, equality impact assessment when they are finding themselves in extraordinary conditions like this, where they monitor and review policy responses, when they collect data, which in Europe, for example, we have a particular difficulty to collect. For other reasons. I guess this is a wider discussion. And then we can also talk about political leaders when we talk about states. They do use at times hateful language in speeches, statements, social media posts, policies, and so on against religious minorities. There's one very interesting example of a Facebook post in March 2020 of the Minister of Health in Cambodia actually arguing against the Khmer Islam, which is something which is obviously something that the responsible political leader should not do. And then we can also consider the role of international actors or supranational actors. The role of the WHO is clear. They have issued guidelines. They have completely and directly addressed faith communities. So that was, if you want, a good practice example. But then also we have to remind other international organizations, including all to local human rights activists and civil society, of the need to be constantly alert. Constantly not during pandemic times or the times of the pandemic, but also during what we call ordinary times, because as I said earlier on, religious minority offense not you know, grow all of a sudden when there is background to them. And also in connection to that, cultivate the kind of alliances that, for example, states have with international organizations. How about state and faith actor partnership? And learn from earlier pandemics, whether it's HIV/AIDS, whether it's Ebola, there is a lot of prior experience in that respect. And finally, if you want to really talk about how democracies work, I think we should not forget religious leaders. They were mentioned in our response before, but I think the role of religious leaders is crucial because, as was correct, they can convey powerful messages in terms of crisis. Why? Because they know their local communities, but they are also at the same time a potential source of false and inaccurate information. So if we are to give the picture, I think we should stress the special responsibility that these actors have to dispel misinformation that may then lead to victimization and stigma. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyriaki. Kerstin, please.
Well, I guess I can add to that what both previous speakers already outlined quite well. Concerted efforts are needed indeed. And as Kyriaki pointed out very well, I guess it needs religious communities, it needs religious leaders on board, but also not only concerning their own community, maybe also concerning much more interface engagement and interface initiatives. And in that sense, also maybe at the national level, in kind of establish an interface council, bring religious leaders together at the national level, but maybe then also at the EU level, for example. And ultimately, I guess what's really needed is also maybe more religious literacy in terms of maybe a proper knowledge, much more knowledge in terms of religious practices. And this leads also to kind of how do we educate our youth in terms of religious literacy? Maybe there is much more needed also in terms of curricular changes, in terms of human rights, but also religious literacy. So I guess both is needed in order to really tackle this climate of anxiousness towards religion, hate speech, xenophobia. I guess if you really want to start at the very basic, then we have to think of new ways of teaching religions and teaching human rights, I guess. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. The following round of questions is about human dignity and whether you think that this concept is a useful concept to base measures to counteract discrimination against religious minorities. So do you think that this is a concept on which we can sort of develop policies against discrimination, or it is, especially in legal terms, a concept that is too broad? So it's a sort of wishful thinking, a sort of inspiration, but with a very limited use. Kyriaki first, and then Kerstin, and then Detlev. I'm not sure if Kyriaki is actually online. Kerstin, do you want to proceed? And then we'll see whether we can. Exactly, please.
Okay. Well, I think the concept of human dignity is a very good basis as a starting point, if you so wish, to develop all other initiatives. And I'm just pointing to this Punta del Este Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone, which has been based on an initiative of scholars in the field of law, religion, state and church relationships, and dating back in 2018, kind of celebrating 70 years of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. So I guess this is a good starting point for sure. And a point of reaffirming human rights, but it's not enough I think it's not enough. It's, as you rightly pointed out, it's very broad, it's very vague, but it's a good starting point from where you can then develop policies and approaches. But certainly in terms of religious minorities, it needs a bit more, and it needs to be a bit much more concrete. And when looking at the UN Declaration for the Rights of Minorities, for example, it's kind of a good starting point, quite broad and but also concise when it comes to the rights of religious minorities. But it's still not a binding declaration. So maybe we should also think of evolving or getting into the field of binding declarations, and maybe trying to get this declaration to become and to develop maybe a binding force. I guess that's what is needed and what is much more prominent than human dignity is a good starting point, as I said, but maybe especially in the field of religious minorities, it needs something much more binding, also at UN level, for example. Thank you.
Detlev, please. I also have a question by Ikan, and it somehow connected because it's about which instruments and mechanisms at international level can be relevant. Perhaps somehow you responded already at the European level, and Kerstin with a reference to Punta del Este declaration. But if you want to elaborate on this, and then we recuperate the Kyriaki, you are after Detlev. Please, Detlev.
Thank you. My answer will be nearly the same as that of Kerstin. I want to cite the first paragraph of the first article of the German Constitution. It says, human dignity shall be inviolable. To respect and protect it shall be the duty of all state authority. So human dignity is perhaps the highest value in the democratic state governed by the rule of law, but it is very general. So some minutes before, I was already citing the Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights and protecting religion in its active and passive part. And I think in any good constitution, democratic constitution, there should be one article or paragraph protecting religion in that way. The relation between religion and the state and religious communities differs quite a lot from state to state. So there are different models in that relation. You have, on the one side, state churches, as in Denmark or in Sweden. On the other hand, you have, for instance, in the example of France, no intervention into the religious sphere of the inhabitants. But in any case, the religion as a personal human right of every citizen shall be protected, and that is a right, perhaps in contrast to other rights, which you also must be allowed to live in community with others. It's not only individual right, but it is a right to do communal acts together with other believers. So that would be my answer at this point. And now I would, Kyriaki.
My question was about human dignity, and I hope you heard the question before you were disconnected.
Okay. I guess the question, and my apologies for the technical mishap. I think if we are supposed to reflect on human dignity, my proposal is that we use it as a starting point. Why? For a functional, but also for, if you want, a theoretical reason. The theoretical reason is that human dignity has been afforded a multitude of definitions, whether we look at constitutions, consider the difference between Germany and South Africa, for example, that both treat human dignity in constitutional terms, but also because we are it's very difficult to separate it from its moral dimension. So for me, human dignity would be probably a good starting point, but would not necessarily tell us the whole story, if you want, if we want to really devise a comprehensive and holistic way to approach religious minorities. And I will become more specific very briefly. Human dignity, as the tolerance, as the move, if you want, from tolerance to respect for the rights of the others to worship, practice, and live in accordance with their religious convictions is a very common, if you want, understanding of the term. In that sense, I think it can be particularly useful in contexts where, for example, a narrative is used that the disease is striking only the religious other and not us. So it's impactful only on others, and there is if you want, an attached religious immunity from the disease argument put forward. Once that assumption collapses, then human dignity can, if you want, to kick in, and it can contribute to delegitimize, if you want, the authority and the power and the impact that religious supremacists and exclusivists have. But from then on, I think other elements need to step in. And here I'm referring, and in a sense, slightly repeating myself on the real need to consider the strengths of religious communities. They are rarely incorporated in public policy, let alone health policy. So if we decide that we view religious communities as others, this, and not as a separate, distinct cultural phenomenon, then I think we can start a new round of arguments and discussions. And apparently there is historical precedent on that. We should not underestimate the power of religious communities. I did read of a scenario, of a historical fact actually, in 1904 in Iran, and at the times of the cholera pandemic, where there was a collective religious movement within the community, within a religious community, the main religious community, leading to an uprising, and then ultimately leading to the introduction of the parliamentary system. So you see, there is a chain which is possible, and that chain should include agency of religious actors. Then another thing that I think we should consider here is focus and expose the positive contributions of religious communities during the pandemic, because that is essential. That not only counters hate speech or acts as counter speech, but is also something which is meaningful in concrete terms. The other thing that is a bit of a puzzle right now, but and I think we should start trying to sort it out, is how policymakers better, how can they better integrate religious voices in public health? Plus, of course, what happens after the public health emergency starts to subside in terms of economic and social recovery. And my final point is here that in scenarios like the one we're discussing today, of a pandemic and of identity, so religious actors, religious movements, religious communities, it is important to stress the power of innovation and adaptation, but also the power of accommodation. How to preserve life and faith at the same time, and in that context, yes, human dignity has a weight as a factor in an argument. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now at the end of our discussion. Wish to thank our panelists, Detlev Rein from the Advisory Committee of the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, Kerstin Wonisch from Eurac Research, and Kyriaki Topidi from the ECMI. And I wish to thank all of those who attended our webinar today, and especially those who have sent us their comments and questions. A special thanks to the colleagues of the Institute for Minority Rights at Eurac Research who have made this webinar possible, in particular Johanna Mitterhofer, who today has also collected the questions from the chat. I wish to recall that all webinars are recorded, and you can find them in the website of the Institute for Minority Rights and on YouTube. I invite all of you to participate and attend the next webinar on the 10th of June at 4 p.m., not 3 p.m. as today, but 4 p.m. on indigenous peoples in times of the pandemic. I hope you enjoyed the discussion of today. Thanks again to all of you, in particular to our panelists, and goodbye.